Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast. Hey, Adapters. Welcome back to another exciting episode. Returning to the podcast is Dr. Susanne Moser, a world-leading expert in climate adaptation. Susie's back to discuss a new report she's co-authored, The Tasks of Now, Toward a New Era in Climate Resilience Building. We explore how adaptation strategies have evolved and why we need to shift from incremental approaches to truly transformational action. Susie makes a compelling case for multisolving, tackling climate, social, and economic challenges together, and outlines the urgent need for better coordination, deeper investment, and a more justice-oriented approach to resilience. We talk about the funding gaps holding this work back, the untapped role of the private sector, and why foundations have a unique opportunity to lead, especially in light of the massive pullback on climate action from the federal government. Yes, now more than ever, we need private funders to step up. We also dig into something I think is often overlooked: communication. Susie and I talk about why effective outreach and engagement are not just extras, they're core to successful adaptation, and they need to be funded accordingly. If you're working in or funding climate adaptation, this is a conversation you don't want to miss. It's always a treat having Susie on. Let's get this conversation started. Hey, Adapters, joining me is Dr. Susanne Moser. Susie is the director and principal researcher of Susanne Moser Research and Consulting. Hi, Susie. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. It's so great to be with you again.
Yeah, I guess I missed you at some of the recent conferences. You and I usually get a chance to chat in person, but it's been a while, so it's great to have you on the podcast. You've been on before, and those are always popular episodes. Okay, Susie, can you just tell us a little bit about what you do there with the consulting work before we jump into the report that we're going to talk about?
I've been working on climate adaptation for, the better part of my career, 30 plus years, long before it was a popular thing, or I should say a necessary thing in the US. And I've been working a lot on adaptation to climate change in coastal regions and urban areas, but also in rural areas. More recently, I'm really interested in infrastructure issues, finance issues, and mental health issues related to climate change. So I've spanned the gamut, if you will, but it in many ways reflects like how the field has evolved and what are the frontiers that we need to deal with.
I thought I was an old timer. I've been doing it for 20 years, and boy, you've got that beat. And at some point, you're going to have to write the definitive book on the history of adaptation. So I think...
Funny you should mention it.
Oh, okay. Is that in the works?
It's definitely cooking, yes.
Oh, great. Fantastic. All right, Susie. So I have you on for a specific reason. Of course, we can talk about anything we want, but you've recently published a report that was funded by a foundation. I want you to give me all the details there because I'm just generalizing, but it's called The Tasks of Now, Toward a New Era in Climate Resilience Building. Tell us about that.
To do that, I want to step back for 1 minute to say I've done this work together with Joyce Coffey. I think you have had her on the show as well. Many in the adaptation field know her. Climate Resilience Consulting was approached by the Packard Foundation to do an update on a report that Joyce and I and Aleka Seville did in 2017 for the Kresge Foundation. That first report in 2017 was basically, the question we try to answer is take a look across the entire United States and what does the field look like? What's happening? What's not happening? Can we describe the field of the professional field of climate adaptation? So we did that and we laid out a framework for how to even think about a field. What the hell is it? And then assess in each one of the dimensions that we came up with. And that report, I think, was really helpful to get I almost want to say a baseline. It was the first time that kind of assessment was done. And then the Packard Foundation just came to us toward the end of last year and said, it's been a while. Can you update that? Because there's more foundations that want to come into this area. They want to know how to be useful. And so this would be basically an assessment update that would inform philanthropic investment in the climate adaptation field. And of course, at the time, we were still in the pre-Trump era. We were still hoping that we would be able to continue with the kind of federal engagement that we had. But essentially, we laid out an update on the state of the field, and we definitely saw improvements. We can go more into detail on that. And we also felt it is just not going fast enough. It's not going deep enough. It's not spreading across the sectors widely enough, if you will. And so we just basically said we need transformative action, both in the field and from the philanthropic community, to move us forward with the speed that climate change is basically pacing out for us now.
And I'd just like to note that I do know Joyce, but she's actually never been on the podcast. We've had some conversations and there's been some discussions on particular projects. But yeah, I've seen her around. She's a regular at all the conferences and such. So I know Joyce, and I know you guys worked on that Rising one together too. So just want to mention that. At any point you want to sort of reference back to that Rising report too, because it actually has been a while. And I'm curious, so Kresge had you guys do that one, and then you had Packard doing this one. Were they communicating? Was it like, all right, we'll do the follow-up? How did that all work?
Yeah, actually, Packard is interested in this report for its own decision making, is informing its own sort of choices. But in the fall of 2024, President Biden released the National Climate Resilience Strategy. And alongside that, a number of funders came together and said, we're making a commitment from our side, from the philanthropic side, to essentially help deliver on the climate resilience strategy. And a lot of different foundations signed on to this. And then Packard, the Kresge Foundation, the Moore Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation got together and said, yeah, but let's first get smart about what this field looks like and how to do that. And so those four foundations essentially commissioned this report. And so they've been talking. Our contact was mostly through Packard in terms of this day-to-day management of the project. But that group of the four big funders in this space, that was the originating group, if you will. And they have since taken it to a group that's probably 20, 30 or more funders to inform them and help them learn, because they may or may not have been part of climate resilience thinking. They might have done work in mitigation, but not on the resilience side.
Okay, I want to come back to that about what the foundations are doing with this. And I just would like to add, and President Biden did release it, it was the National Resilience, it was called a framework, not even a strategy. And I want to come back to the messaging. True. That was a horrible name, and I said that at the time. And I just would like to add too is that the State Department, just before the new administration came in, they actually released a national adaptation plan, which actually
You're right.
So it lasted all of a week. It's officially filed, but of course it's now being ignored. But they did get it in, and I think that was an accomplishment. And when we circle back around, maybe with a different administration, the baseline was there. There was, I think, some of that confusion. The National Resilience Framework was an attempt at it, but it wasn't really the official one.
Yeah, and the strategy itself is a cobbled together, 600 pages or something, an enormous document that puts a lot of pieces together and with a little bit of glue. But some of us would say that too isn't exactly a strategy, even though they call it that.
There was some asm and issues of how communication is emphasized too. It was a big issue for me, and we're going to get also into that. But give us a little background too, and how did you do this report? And I know you talked to people externally too to get some of the content, and I'll just be transparent here, and I was one of them. But how did you guys decide to get that to help you inform the writing of the report?
Yeah, we had a significantly smaller budget to do this, and the Packard Foundation emphasized again and again, they don't want that deep of a dive as we did in 2017. That would have taken a lot longer. Basically, they just wanted something relatively quick. And so what we basically decided is, can we identify between Packard and ourselves the people who essentially we go to get a sense of what's needed, what's out there, what's happening. And because it was a really short timeline to do this, we didn't get nearly half of the people that we wanted to talk to, but we got a really good set of people who I deeply trust and feel give me some reliable, if you will, pulse checking from around the country. We did that. We interviewed them. We looked at a lot of different documents that have come out in either from the federal government or from other states or just from the academic literature to update. We use the same framework, and I can talk about that framework, the 4P framework, to assess the field. And then we basically ask a whole bunch of questions of the interviewees and we synthesize it. And the thing is, we heard again and again a rather clear message that this incremental, project-based, project-by-project approach to adaptation is just not good enough, because things are happening so fast and we're doing adaptation with a rather varying quality, and we just need to get ahead of this. And that means truly transformative approaches and rethinking both how we fund it, rethinking how we evaluate it, how we communicate about it, how we do it. Especially training people, the workforce to implement it. We just don't have enough people to do all the work. And that was when we had money to do it, right? It's just not happening fast enough. And so we see these devastating disasters, whether it's what happened with the hurricanes in the Southeast or whether it's what happened in LA. It's not at a scale now that is it's a little bit beyond everyone. Everyone is just shell-shocked and they have to keep going, and now with fewer resources. So I think we need to really rethink both how we do adaptation and how we fund it.
I want to talk a little bit more about that. And you just mentioned the incremental and then even in the report, a project by project approach. And a big thing that you've talked about for a while now is transformative adaptation. We even did an episode on it with Dr. Linda Shai. And tell me what that looks like, though. You've just talked about that. Your foundation, it's like, all right, you want to fund a project. It has to be something. And yet, what would a transformative adaptation project or initiative look like?
I think it would be important to quality check first. What are the issues that communities are facing? They're not just climate driven and nothing else is going on, right? We have, at the same time, a biodiversity crisis. We have poverty. We have racism. We have toxic pollution. We have food deserts. We have, in some places, really economic opportunities for people. Education is in shambles, and so on and so forth, right? And now in this country, you add political polarization and, in fact, recent pullback from the federal government on all things related to climate. So that's both at the global and at the national level. We're seeing these very complex problems, right? And then we're trying to come in and just say, oh, can we elevate the building so it doesn't flood? That is just not enough to address the profound complexity of the challenges that communities face. So what we need instead is solutions that are just as not necessarily complicated, but that address multiple issues at the same time. It's also actually more efficient if we do that. We call that concept, and it's not my term, it's Beth Sawin's term from the Multisolving Institute. She calls it multisolving. Right? It is the idea that you take one action that addresses multiple problems at the same time and always centers equity in the center of it. Just if we don't do that, we are just simply missing the boat on what's necessary to address the root causes, the vulnerabilities at the bottom of where they come from. And that means mindset changes, value changes, belief changes. That means changes in who sits around the decision-making table. How do people relate? How is power shared or not shared? Those factors in many ways then determine what kind of policies get set or what kind of practices are considered reasonable or good or best. Who gets what resources? So it's really the transformative change that is necessary comes from all of those decisions. And most of what we do right now in the field is essentially just regular old planning or disaster recovery without thinking about how could we build back in a way that is better, that makes, right now we're already not whole. And then until that we experience a disaster, and how do we come back from that so we don't just set ourselves up for the next disaster with more of the same, right? So people can get really creative in trying to reorganize. And it's a challenging thing. You don't start at the moment of disaster to think about that, because what do you want most when you're in the middle of a disaster? You want back to normal, whatever normal was yesterday, which is better than having nothing right now. But yesterday's normal it was not fine. It was not a great thing, right? People want to have more integrated communities. They don't want to drive hours and hours, be stuck in traffic to go to work that's far away because they can't afford to live closer to it. Those are the kinds of issues that would be transformative if we found ways to address that. And it would literally solve more than one problem at once, climate being one of them, but not the only one.
And one of the areas I want to jump into is this notion of climate adaptation. And you and I both know this, that it gets a small fraction of the climate finance, all the climate dollars that are out there. And my attitude about this is that, okay, until recently, when it comes to the mitigation carbon side, we're talking really big money, giant projects, billion-dollar projects. You could do a lot more in the adaptation resilience space. And I'm curious, what's the chatter with foundations? Because I almost feel like, all right, the mitigation, the private sector folks are on that. Is maybe you guys should be the ones pivoting and really creating some traction on the resilience and adaptation side.
Gosh, there's four things in that question.
Take
One is that we did recommend in our report, which I want to emphasize, our report is primarily oriented toward philanthropy, people who have had some, but maybe not very deep experience with working in the climate resilience space. And what we were told is that essentially there wasn't going to be this ginormous new programmatic sort of pot that is all about climate resilience. It's more like people needed to see how they contribute to climate resilience and make the right choices and maybe be more strategic about their investment. So that's one piece. And recognizing the sort of the ginormous difference in terms of what the federal government can pay for and what philanthropy typically puts out. Important, but relatively speaking, a much smaller pot. We know 100% that we need the private sector and its resources in this game, both for the businesses themselves to shore up their activities, but also to be playing a much more significant role in creative financing, if you will. We suggested that philanthropy can play an important role in helping to build these bridges, if you will, in helping to, whether it's convening or whether it's supporting pilots or taking off the risk of some good ideas that are already out there. There are many things that are happening in the private sector. I was just listening this morning to a whole webinar on blockchain and AI and how that can all help with climate finance. And
I was on that one too briefly. Just I had to get ready for your interview, so I barely lasted 10 minutes. But okay, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Go on.
Yes, it was a challenging one for me to listen to as well. And what's really significant for me is that none of these people, they may be experts in the climate finance field or in the finance and the policy field related to that, and they've had no experience with climate resilience building in the way we have now learned over 20 years of doing this kind of work, how to do that. So I'm really concerned about all these hotshot ideas to come in without learning, for example, what we've learned about community engagement and justice and very different processes of how to bring the community and put them in the driver's seat. Anyway, the point is there are many opportunities, right? But there's also risk in that, if you will, engagement with the private sector and all these new tools. Where do we work this out? I think philanthropy has a role to play in letting us explore that without causing too much damage. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. And I've started to cover the corporate side a bit more on the podcast, and I've been able to link in with some folks. And I'm actually encouraged by it. It's not that they're doing it well across the board, but it's like they're taking an interest finally. And I don't know if you've interacted with groups like Tailwind. I've had them on, and just I think it's very interesting how they're engaging even the startup culture and getting them to think about it. And they've created a sort of an ecosystem of what's going on out there. And it's just, these are the growing things you have to do. But I'm somewhat encouraged because the first 10 years of my experience with adaptation, it was just the natural resource sector. That's all that it was. And that was not going to do. And so it's just any movement into new sectors, I think, is a good thing.
Yeah, there's enormous opportunities to learn, right? And yes, it's going to stretch us all in terms of having to learn new things, but it could very well just be another instrument to make money. And that, to me, is not transformative. That's more of the same, right? That's not necessarily helping people be more in control of their own communities and the lives they want to live and control over the resources they manage, whatever. So I think there's a lot that needs to be brought into these new developments from the experience we've had over the last 20 years. And like I said, in the report, we make it very clear. It's not all rosy. It's not all like we had it all figured out and now just the funding went away or something. No, there's a lot that still needs to be improved and deepened in the existing adaptation space and integrating that in this multisolving way that I talked about and getting really deep down into the work of decolonizing and all the work around social justice, economic and cultural restoration that is necessary.
Okay, thank you for that nice pivot, because that is a big part of the report. And I know it's an issue that you have been working on for many years, is the idea of climate justice, equity, environmental justice. And okay, let's just acknowledge the reality of what's going on at the federal level. It's basically a witch hunt. They're just scrubbing the entire federal government of all those efforts, and they're firing people for having even worked on these areas. That's the reality now. And now it seems like the private sector is taking the cue, is that, all right, we don't even need to to talk about it that much. That sucks, but that's a reality. How do you look at that? And the recommendations, and this is how we do transformational adaptation. What really is the path ahead, at least in the short term?
It's very difficult for me to make generalized statements about that because people have different vulnerabilities, exposures, and sensitivities in terms of what they work on and how much their work is not just has to go into the shadow to not be seen or be attacked, whatever, but literally financially having been deprived of the means to do the work. It is definitely challenging. And I will just simply state my own work, which is all about all the things that we now can no longer talk about, is at risk. And I think we'll see how it plays out. I guess for me personally, and that has everything to do with my own history and where I come from, but I will find ways to speak about climate, justice, governance, diversity, any of those things in ways that don't necessarily use those words. And I think we can be incredibly subversive by doing so. So I feel, it is real. The threat is real. The attack on immigrants, on people working on the front lines, it's absolutely, there's no doubt about it. It is a very dangerous time. And I think there are ways in which we can do this work and continue to talk about it, but in ways that maybe their AI doesn't pick us up.
Oh my gosh, just the sloppiness of what they're doing too, even if they have a very diabolical agenda, they're just the sloppiness and how they're doing it. Anyway, so I agree, and hopefully we'll use my podcast to have those, I like that word, subversive conversations. I just released an episode. I worked with NRDC on flood disclosure laws. And you think of this dry subject, but it's actually pretty embedded in how we run societies. Like you sell a home and a lot of states don't make you provide that information. Has your house been flooded before? And so anyway, what getting at is that I had a woman whose home flooded. She was in rural Georgia. She was great. And she did not have that sort of information. And so just, you can get to those climate justice through some of the processes and legislation, and there's sort of other ways to do it, and without you necessarily saying those words, which I also obviously think is outrageous and ridiculous. We still need to plug ahead on those. So there's ways of doing it.
And what's really interesting is I remember in 1998, I was working as a postdoc fellow for the Heinz Center in Washington, D.C., and we did a project that was at the time funded by FEMA about whether or not to include the fact that a coastline is a dynamic thing. It doesn't stay in place for all the reasons we know, sea level rise being one of them, and whether or not to include that information in disclosure of risk on FEMA maps. And oh my God, and this was after already 20 or so years of people trying to get that very fact into FEMA maps and having them more dynamically updated and all the rest of it. And the pushback from the development community was tremendous. Something super watered down was eventually included, but nothing really changed until more recently. And now you go on Zillow, you go on Realtor.com, and it has flood information, it has fire information, air quality information. It's all there, right? So we're beginning to see a shift in the development community itself. They weren't forced to do that. They're now doing that on their own. Why? Because they've begun to see, first of all, they're liable, right? Because the information is out. And so when you're liable and you basically just feign ignorance, that's not a good enough protection against lawsuits. So that's one important thing. And it's becoming a risk factor for people, for the development community itself. Another reason where we are seeing that the private sector is beginning to pay attention and coming up with all kinds of tools. Now they're not transparent. They don't tell us enough. It doesn't change necessarily who gets to live there or what we do with the people who already live in high risk areas, all of that. But I think there's an important signal here, I think, that we're picking up, right? That the private sector is actually beginning to see this important to its bottom line. And I think that's an opportunity.
I should have mentioned this earlier. For those who want to actually look at the report, I have links in the show notes. You can just look in the show notes for this podcast. Definitely check those out. And one of the areas, and we're not going to be able to go all over it, just we can't do that. But one of the areas I want to focus on too is this notion of the next generation of adaptation professionals. And this is a recommendation within, there's all sorts of things foundations could do to encourage the development of adaptation professionals. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so there's simply not enough of us who are trained to do this. One of the things that has slowed down a lot of efforts in whether it's in government or in private sector is that people have basically assigned, oh, you're the chief resilience officer, you're the one climate person, or for heaven forbid, for the one sustainability person for maybe an entire state or for an entire agency or whatever. And that basically meant, okay, I don't have to think about it. That person is thinking about it. And then they wonder why nothing really changes, right? Climate change is affecting every single one of us, and everyone's work in some way needs to change because of it. And we could have a good, fun game over whether that's true. I'm actually convinced that's true. But anyway, the point is, we don't have enough people going into work, whether it's planning or engineering or doctors or psychologists or spiritual faith leaders or people, even ecologists, whatever. We don't have enough people going into their respective professions, having deep understanding of climate change and these complexities that I mentioned earlier. And they continue to do their stuff in a very siloed way, assuming static environment, or they're all of a sudden faced with, oh no, it's not static. Now what do I do? And it takes forever, right? What we're saying was in our report is that if you want to really make a difference, change the pipeline. There's so much more funding that goes into education than it goes into climate. Then use that funding for education and build the pipeline and the way into the professions that are now all touched by climate change. That's one example. It's also important that leaders don't just get technical information. Climate change is not just a technical problem. It is an ecological, a social, a psychological, a spiritual one, however you want to see it. But we only get trained on the technical side. That's not good enough. When you're an engagement professional, you need to have social skills. You need to have psychological skills to not only deal with it yourself, but to essentially guide and support the community that's affected dramatically, often traumatically by climate change. So how do you do that? I do a lot of my own training for people in becoming more trauma-informed climate professionals, as an example. Or if we're talking transformative change, what does that mean in practice? What do we need to learn? How do I even begin to think about that? That's the kind of stuff that we haven't done enough of. And I think lots of different funders, even the ones who are not traditionally in the climate space, would find that exciting to fund.
This is an issue near and dear to me, is just developing that next generation of adaptation professionals. I have a lot of young people reach out to me asking how they can get into it. And one of the things that I've focused on in the podcast is like, there's not a lot of university programs that, okay, I can get a degree in adaptation. And some people might not even think that's a good thing. I had a conversation, I think it was Dr. Eric Chu, he's out in California, that that there's all these professors doing some incredible adaptation work, but they don't necessarily have a program. They have an institute that they've embedded in those universities, but there's not that full-on commitment. And Eric was telling me that it's just creating a program obviously is really expensive, where you actually are creating a degree program, be a graduate. And so here's some advice for the foundation world. And I'm not sure if it came out to that level of detail within the report, endowing some universities with a big chunk of money so they can develop these programs. Because even the development of that program, you're going to have a lot of lessons learned. You're going to bring a lot of people together, and then you will start having programs where students can take and they get that sort of integrated adaptation training. And yeah, I think there's they could experiment with that, endow some of these universities for adaptation programs.
I'm sure they would love to hear that right now, given the funding cuts from the federal funding sources. And I think what's really important here too is to throw in that in the foundation world, people talk a lot about next gen funders. In other words, there's this ginormous transition of a lot of wealth from people who are now older and dying to the next generation. And all of a sudden, all these people inherit their dad's or father's or mother's wealth and need to figure out what to do with it. And this next generation of donors, individuals of high wealth, essentially, is slightly different than the world of traditional foundations. There's definitely different interests or different drivers and different ways of interacting with them. But that next generation of high wealth individuals is, I think, particularly primed to do what you're saying. I want a chair whatever in this university that my alma mater or whatever, right? So there's definitely a possibility there, or people investing in institutes or fostering or feeding into like collaborative philanthropy by working together with others, which is, I think, another really important and new approach. So I think there's definitely a possibility for that to happen, but all that requires relationship building like everywhere else. That's not going to happen all by itself. And I hope that a lot of universities are on the ball and are doing that, but it's not it's not quick, I should say, to move in that direction.
Right. And I think Columbia has done a bit of this. They obviously have ramped up their climate efforts. And I do think it might be some private funding that has allowed them to do some of that. But yeah, I think some of these universities that like to take that approach, they need to have a vision too. I don't know if it's necessarily on let's say this foundation drops a lot of money to create a graduate adaptation program. Yeah, a professor is going to have to really engage and give a vision of what that would look like. But that wouldn't be that difficult, especially if you have the right partners.
There's many structural barriers to that, right? Yes, we have in some universities moved to these interdisciplinary or maybe even transdisciplinary programs where, people really engage across different colleges, different disciplines, departments, but there's still structural barriers to doing that. But that's precisely the kind of change that would be necessary to actually be transformative in the whole thing, right? If we continue to just stay in our disciplinary silos, it's just as bad as what we've done so far. So really, to reach across and to shed a light from all different perspectives and disciplines on these ginormous problems of the Anthropocene, I think that's when we begin to see. And you see it in institutes around the world, right? When you have a sort of critical mass of really smart thinkers from multiple disciplines, that's when you have breakthrough thinking. That's when you get really new ideas, new approaches, new models, whatever out there. And I think that's what we need. And I think it's quite possible to move in that direction. But it takes a shock like we're experiencing right now in this country to get that moving.
I want to talk about communication. Obviously, that's what I do for a living. And again, I want to recommend your report. It's very readable and it's not too long. And then you have appendices that kind of summarize the recommendations. And that's how my brain operates. So I appreciate that. That's I'm like, all right, what did you really say in all this? And I just want to read here is what the recommendation at the very end of one of the appendices is that support the design and implementation of a coordinated strategic national climate resilience communication strategy. I would call it adaptation communication strategy. That's okay. And I want to dig into that. And I've pushed that, even though I think a national adaptation plan would be really helpful, I think a national communication plan should be phase one. And I've said over and over again, I'm glad to see that there's on the ground adaptation projects going on out there. We have to experiment, but I think it's going to be years before we consistently being like, okay, we're all doing this. But in the meantime, doing communication, creating awareness for different audiences is something easier and that we could actually do. And in the National Resilience Framework that Biden released, there was nothing about communication, nothing. Yep. And it's like, first off, I don't know who was a planning committee for that, because I can't believe it, because that's the lowest hanging fruit in all this. And to get the public behind what we're all trying to do here with resilience planning, having a communication strategy would be great. And so here, I think, even though the federal government's stepping back, I want you to talk about this. What might that look like? Could you do it from a private sector side? Could we have this national communication strategy?
That's a really interesting question, that last one, whether the private sector could do that. If you have the private sector run it, what you'll get is something pretty self-interested for whoever it is. To me, the benefit of having a public or a philanthropic source behind it is that there is something more comprehensive, something less self-interested, and maybe really like fostering a renewed sense of shared aspirations that we're after. What do we want? And this, to me, reflects very much our 4P framework. One of the first things that the first P stands for purpose. Why are we doing this? What do we want? There's so many people in this country who are so deeply dedicated and passionate about creating a socially just and ecologically thriving and economically just and opportunity-rich environment, communities where people know each other and support each other and all of those things, right? The things we want. That when you ask Americans across any red, blue, whatever state or political sort of delineations, there are things that we actually all want. And to me, showing people that this is what we're working toward and introducing both the individuals who work for that, the organizations that work for that, and then come to some shared understanding of what are the things that hold them back in fulfilling that promise, that aspiration, if you will, and inviting people to be part of the solution. So many people now are in a crisis of meaning and they wonder, how can I help? If there was a very clear vision of what is it that we're actually after, and these aspiration-based communication strategies actually have been shown to work to help knit people across these social divisions back together. So it's not the solution to all our problems, but I think there is ground that we can find that could bring us together. And I think if that's what a strategy could do, a communication strategy, and then show what the role is in adaptation, in changing our energy sources, all the rest of it. And again, a multisolving approach, showing how each of these different aspects contribute to building the life we all want, then I think that would be generating goodwill. That would generate some understanding of why we need to make certain changes. And it could bring us along. I'm far from being a rosy-eyed person in this department. And I think it's absolutely possible with concerted effort, big resources toward that kind of communication, that people would feel inspired again. Right now, people are battered. People feel just disheartened. And every new disaster just adds more injury to insult, if you will. And so uplifting people, working toward these shared goals and showing real life examples, that to me is what makes for good communication. And it would accelerate, right? It would accelerate. If we can, like somebody does something great in some little town and I don't even know about it, to pick up those stories and amplify them and show them to the rest of them, and then they can replicate it. We don't have to reinvent that wheel a million times over. We can learn from that, and you need communication for that. So that needs to be part of it.
And I guess it's just I should watch the language that I use. When I say private sector, and in my head too, it could mean a nonprofit, it could be a foundation. I was just like, again, I didn't mean like government led. So I did probably see maybe foundations the only ones with the funding resources here. And I drew a blank because I was in the federal government for a while. And all right, you have these national level things. Of course, the government has to be involved. Are there successful models of just private, and I'm saying private sector? And there are. And I had to search for some. I'm like, all right, what is, and I found Mothers Against Drunk Driving is not government led. And that has been like everyone knows about that one. And so there's models out there where we could do this. And I also think that a communication strategy is not going to be dealing with creating regulations and those kind of things. And at least initially, it could just be something that we could learn from. It could be that sort of narrative device to create that awareness. So I think there'd be a huge opportunity. And like you just said, taking the smaller stories at the local level and amplifying them. There's all sorts of things that could come out of this. And right now, I think people are just desperate for some leadership, but we've got to create some platforms for some leaders to come out. So
I agree. And we need to reach people's heart. It's not just an educational thing and just explaining things. It really needs to excite people. People need to align themselves with these aspirational goals that we're after. What does it mean, right, to have a good American life, or, if you will, a good Earthling life, if you want to go beyond? It's a good example to think what happens to USAID. Most Americans don't know a thing about that agency. And people could be all raw about cutting whatever, federal bureaucracy or something that has no meaning to most Americans. And they couldn't be further wrong about that. Not only the farmers who benefit from the government buying the grains that they can then sell or donate to hungry people elsewhere in the world, but so many aspects that people have no idea about how USAID is actually entirely in the American interest, what they do. And it's a communication failure that we did not educate America about what its government agencies actually do and how it benefits them. And I think adaptation and climate work has so long been written off as, oh, this is just these, Marxist greenies who will destroy our economy. And nothing further from the truth, right? It's absolutely to sustain the ability to have an economy, to have a functional society, to have functional infrastructure, that we're working on these things. And unless we make that really clear, people will feel it's expendable. It's okay. Let it go.
I just saw it on social media, but it was a picture of probably like a 10-year-old boy. I think it was Angola. And they're just saying he was on HIV medicine and he died 2 weeks ago because his medicine stopped. And it's just, boy, that was a gut punch. It's okay. Direct Line, USAID, the programs it supports. And this kid is dead now because we stopped those things. Ugh.
There is a very long list of people who will die that will be on this administration's record.
Yes. Okay, I still, on that note, but obviously the communication strategy, I think, is something that the foundation world could get behind pretty quickly. And I brought this up in my interview with you, and I want to bring it up again now because I still think it's a somewhat good idea, is that all these projects that are being funded, they get funded, there's some lessons learned, maybe they share them at a conference or something, but then really nothing happens there. And what I've been pushing on my podcast is that you get a grant and you get X amount and they say, okay, you need to write in 5% to communicate this thing. You're lucky if you get 10%. And I'm saying maybe you should do 100%. That we used Hollywood as a model, that they spend $100 million on a movie, then they spend $100 million promoting it. And there's no guarantee it'll be a blockbuster, but they do that because long term, it's how they make money. It's how they get that awareness. And I still think there's some lessons to be learned in what we do, because how many CDs back in the day were created for this toolkit and then they ended up just disappearing because there's no real effort to create the awareness that we need.
I couldn't agree more. I don't know about 100%, but what I can tell
Right.
you is that on projects that I have worked on that had a dedicated communication person, someone who can do the social media, someone who can do press releases, someone who can do the graphic side. Oh my God. We went so much further with it. It makes such a difference, right? Most small little mom and pop shops do not have that kind of staffing. So it is absolutely crucial. And to me, the communication is doing a couple things, right? It is both educating. It is also building the social capital and maintaining the social capital. We need to talk to each other. It's not just like spreading it out. It's dialogic communication that we need, right? And we need to learn from each other. Like I said before, something happens and I never know about it. I'll just reinvent that. And whoa, don't I feel great? I just came up with this new thing. Oh no, there's 7 others who have done it, but I never heard about it. So I think it's absolutely essential to foster all of those things, the connectivity, the learning, the evaluation, all of those things need to feed into each other so that we accelerate. Just doing a little bit more here and there while we are on an exponential curve with the temperature, with sea level rise, with everything else, it's not good enough. We have to accelerate. And so communication is absolutely key to that.
And I also just want to put a plug in that communication and marketing and all these things, those are actual skills. And a lot of smaller groups, they just don't have the skill set and they don't appreciate that. I don't even think the foundation necessarily appreciate it. They're like, all right, write in some communication part of it, but who actually is going to do the communication? What level of expertise? And that is a real thing. And I've worked for conservation groups and I was used to be in that world. And like, all right, you were doing conservation work, but now you're our marketing person. And it's just like, this is a skill set. Respect the skill. And so I would hope to see more of that in this area.
And it's more, in a world where everything is about communication, and we're the one field, the one area that we don't talk about or not nearly enough, or only very privileged organization who have that capacity get to talk about it. I think all of that holds us back to getting to a deeper, a better informed approach to adaptation and resilience building.
All right. We've talked over and over again about how federal agencies are pretty much sidelined at the moment. So where do you see some leadership emerging here? Are you even seeing any? Is it too soon?
Let me just first take your premise about the federal government being sidelined.
Okay.
I want to say the federal colleagues I have and who have not yet been fired, are working like crazy to maintain and uphold the good work that is, even if they can't talk about it anymore in the way we used to 3 months ago. I think that's the first point I want to make. Is there leadership? People are taking very different strategies to dealing with this onslaught of attacks from all sides that seems to be very well prepared and very systematic and very deep in its approach. Some have gone quiet and try to continue to do the good work, but do it, if you will, out of the shadows of not speaking about it, but still continue it pretty much unchanged. And others are reorienting and maybe overtly changing their actual practice to be closer in line. In the immigration community, in the BIPOC community, Indigenous peoples, they're not stepping down. They've been so used to being so deeply sidelined and exploited for generations. So for them, this is more of the same, and maybe for all of us now to see what white supremacy looks like. I think the ones who struggle the most are the sort of white privileged lefty community, if you will, who now sees their life's work, their passions being undermined by this in a very overt way. And I think the leadership, in my mind, comes from any one of us to stand up and make alliances with the people who have experienced this kind of damaging, repressive interaction for a long time and still having the courage to speak up and to say it. And as I said before, I think there are ways to do that in very subversive ways and still gather people around. I think if we were to divide and be in greater competition for the funds that are out there, however limited or wide they are right now, that would be a mistake. I think we need to come together. If there's any chance whatsoever of maintaining the work that needs to be done, it is by working in coalition.
I agree. And one of the recommendations that you had in this is for foundations potentially to convene adaptation leaders. What would that look like? What did you have in mind with that?
There are people who are doing really great work and who need a space to not just be in reactive mode, but to take a deep breath and really step back and much more fundamentally rethink what we're doing. And I think doing that in not just I by myself, but doing that in a group of smart people, like all the people we interviewed for this report, that would be one of the funnest meetings I could imagine going to. It would be so stimulating, right? Because I don't necessarily agree with all of them, but I would be encouraged to think and look in new ways at this issue. And having the best people come together and think about that, think about profoundly shifting how we do the work. Right now, think about this, right? We have for years and years, and I'm one of them, we have complained about what's all wrong with the federal government, and at the same time that we depend on it and we needed it and we got a lot of funding from it. Now we just decapitated the governance systems for adaptation. We've just now only have the state and anything below that left standing. The federal government has just disappeared, and it's not only not funding, policies are getting rolled back. And in fact, you have people fighting what you're doing. What does that mean? How do we rethink adaptation governance at this point, right? How do we then organize ourselves? How do we do the work? Because it needs to get done. Climate change doesn't care one bit about who's in the White House. It just will continue and, in fact, will accelerate if all their policies go through. To me, it needs the space for us to come together and think radically different things about how we organize ourselves, how we fund things, how we get it done, how we get all these people educated and trained and stay sane. So to me, that would be what a retreat would need to do. And I think it would be fabulous to do it. And we should do it like once a year or something.
Let's make this happen. I like the sound of that too. And you could get a podcast out of it so that other people could benefit from what lessons learned. All right. And it's just at your point about climate change isn't going away. It just occurred to me, it's like one of our biggest allies in all this is climate change, and that I hate to think of it as an ally, but it's not stopping. It's happening, and it's something to point to. This is what's happening now, and it's not going away. And so these things have to be done. Okay. I want to talk you had mentioned to it earlier. Packard funded this, but they're talking with other folks, and you've been in communication with other folks, and you've alluded to some of the things that they want to do. Can you give us a bit more information? What now? You've written this report. You've done us all a great service. Can we expect to see anything happen in the next 3 months, 6 months, year?
I think things are already happening. There's probably not a single foundation that has gone to sleep on January 20th. They're all trying to figure out how do we do that. And one of the, I think, positive developments in the foundation world is that there are many more sort of networks of funders, organizations that facilitate conversations among foundations so that they don't do this all by themselves, but also work in coalition and also multisolve and also cross their various respective silos, if you will, of what they cover and what they are experts on. So I think there's a lot of that going on. And foundations are not these monoliths, right? There is a board, there's a staff, there's the executive level. So there is just change in all these levels and navigation and negotiation happening, I think, in all of these realms. And there is no uniform response. From everything I've heard and talking to people, it's just as diverse as the rest of us in terms of how we respond to this and whether we take an overt resistance role or whether we are, like I said before, going into the shadow while continuing, or whether we change what we invest in. And of course, funders come from the entire political spectrum too. So there's foundations working on the opposite side to what we would like to work on. So it's a diverse area. I think for Kresge is one of those foundations that has been very upfront about centering equity and justice in its work. It also has developed several programs where they connect across different internal silos, health and climate, for example, or urban and climate. So there's definitely some foundations that I have a hard time without changing their very heart of, who they are. They're continuing to be out there and visible with that. How they will protect themselves against being targets of attack, that's to be seen. I don't think anybody is necessarily clear. There's others who take a more cautionary approach and who will take climate change off of, or DEI issues off of the front, if you will, of their websites and still continue that work. I think it varies.
I want your advice, and it's a two-part question. So there's not a lot of national platforms to talk about adaptation. I like to consider my podcast one of them, but one that we both go to, I didn't go to the last one, but the National Adaptation Forum, they're going to have another one in 2026. Already seeing some of the kind of planning for that. What advice would you give them in regards to getting ready for that? Because obviously things are much different. They're probably not going to have a lot of federal presence there. And then what advice would you give me in the coming year? What do you think I should cover? What are topics that you think would be important in these sort of changing times?
You're going to hear it here first because we haven't even had our first planning committee meeting. Yes, but I'm on the planning committee for the next NAF. Okay. And one of the things I've already said to them is that if the next NAF is the same as the other NAFs, then I don't think I'm going to be coming, because I just really feel we need to use these national platforms to lift up and push this idea of transformational approaches to resilience building. If we are just more of the same, I think it's insular, it is not inspiring. I think we really need to foster the community building aspect. We need to foster political awareness. We need to be very strategic and have lots and lots of workshops about how to navigate this challenging new environment as adaptation professionals. We need to sharpen people's mind to what does multi-solving look like? How do you still continue justice work, even if you can't talk about it or can't put it in your proposals? So to me, it needs to become a true workshop. It needs to not just be, here, look how great I am and what I've done. It needs to be strategic. It needs to build the community and shore us all up with skills and real strategies to face this world that we're in now.
Okay, just a response to that, but then I want your advice for what I do with the podcast. And I agree. I didn't go to the last National Adaptation Forum. I just couldn't really justify it. I've been to 3 or 4 of them, and in some ways they're fantastic. But in other ways, there's a redundancy. And yeah, I couldn't justify it, especially the budgets that I work off of. So yeah, I hope you can fight that good fight, and you guys do something differently for the next one. So good luck with that.
I'll work on it. And in terms of your own question, what should you lift up in the podcast? I think any voice that you can find that helps us accelerate, deepen, broaden what we do, that helps really elevate and take apart this whole idea of transformational work in the space, that to me would be a reason to come listen.
All right, great. And my last question that I ask everyone, which feeds right into that, if you could recommend one person to come on this podcast, who would it be?
I've only said it now so many times. I don't know if you have. I don't think you have talked to Beth Sawin about multisolving, but have her speak about it. She's a really good speaker anyway, and she's I think what she has to offer and how she thinks, every time I have a conversation with her, and I have quite a few of them, it is mind-opening.
Okay, who's she with? I'm sorry, I missed that. Who's she with?
She runs her own institute called the Multisolving Institute.
Oh, okay. That would be unusual and different. Okay, great recommendation.
Yeah, she's a fantastic systems thinker and she was trained by Donella Meadows of the Limits to Growth fame, if that means anything to you or to the listeners. But she's a really incredible systems thinker and it's like there's something every time that just is counter to what you always think. And, I love that. I love when that happens, when people all of a sudden just wake up, I never thought that. It happens with Beth all the time.
Great. I will look it up. A great recommendation. So Susie, again, thanks with Joyce and your partner in creating this report. You've done a great service, and I hope the foundations can run with this and we'll see some of it because, oh my goodness, it's desperately needed some leadership here. And thanks for everything that you do.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to talk about it and have this opportunity. So you all go out there and keep doing the great work.
Okay, Adapters, that is a wrap. Thanks to Susie for coming on the podcast. I hope you found our conversation as thought-provoking as I did. If there's one thing to take away from this episode, it's that climate adaptation isn't just about managing risk. It's about transformational change. Susie has been a leader making this point for years. It's about addressing overlapping challenges in our climate, our communities, and our institutions, and doing it in a way that's strategic, inclusive, and sustained. Susie's report, The Tasks of Now, lays out a clear call to action, not just for practitioners and policymakers, but for funders. Adaptation needs vision, it needs courage. Foundations have a unique opportunity to step up and lead. By supporting transformational work, investing in the next generation of adaptation professionals, and backing the communication strategies that make these efforts visible, relatable, and ultimately successful, I can't stress that point enough. One of the biggest takeaways for me is that transformational adaptation can't wait, but it's not always safe or possible to push it through the front door. As Susie pointed out, in today's political environment where even climate adaptation work can be targeted or defunded, sometimes the most strategic approach is to be subversive. I love that point Susie made. That means doing the work in ways that avoid detection, building partnerships, supporting communities, investing in justice, and moving adaptation forward quietly without giving hostile actors something to attack. It is a sobering reality, but one that many working in the space are navigating right now. And here's the reality we can't ignore. With the federal government largely absent from any meaningful national leadership on climate adaptation, we need other platforms to carry this conversation, whether it's philanthropy, NGOs, private sector partnerships, or even podcasts like this one. We need to elevate adaptation and keep it front and center. Definitely take time to read Susie's report. Links are in the show notes. It's an easy read, and having a vision is critically important in these crazy times. Okay, on that note, if this conversation with Susie resonated with you, especially the need for transformational adaptation, courageous funding, and smart communication, consider how your organization could be part of that bigger story. America Adapts is one of the few national platforms still consistently covering climate adaptation. And with federal leadership retreating and even targeting climate initiatives, we need new spaces to keep the conversation alive. That's what this podcast is doing, episode by episode. Sponsoring America Adapts puts your organization's adaptation work in front of thousands of engaged listeners, leaders, funders, policymakers, and practitioners who are shaping what comes next. We'll work together to craft your story in a way that sticks, highlighting your achievements, elevating key voices, and building lasting influence well beyond a typical report or webinar. Past sponsors have included World Wildlife Fund, Natural Resources Defense Council, the Department of Defense, yes, and a previous administration, UCLA, Harvard University, the state of New Jersey, and Colorado. And these are just a handful of sponsors that have used this platform to amplify their work. And more than ever, adaptation needs visibility, needs champions, and yes, it needs communication. So if your organization is ready to lead, let's make it happen. Reach out at americaadapts@gmail.com, and let's talk about how we tell your story. Okay, Adapters, keep up the great work. I'll see you next time.